For the purposes of this story, call me Dana. And before I tell you what my family posted from that lake house over Labor Day weekend, I need you to understand something. I wasn't even angry when they told me I couldn't come. I want to start there because everything that happens next only makes sense if you know that first. I didn't slam a door. I didn't cry on the phone. I said okay the same way I'd said okay probably 400 times before, to 400 smaller versions of the same request. Someone needed to stay behind and handle things. Someone always did. That someone was always me. So on the Friday before Labor Day, I hugged my parents in the driveway, waved as my sister Renee's SUV pulled out with 2 coolers and a kayak strapped to the roof, and I went back inside my own quiet house to do the thing I always did when everyone else went somewhere I wasn't invited. I made myself useful from a distance. I paid the overdue invoice on my dad's storage unit. I called the vet about my nephew's dog. I answered 41 text messages over the course of that weekend, most of them starting with some version of "Hey, quick question." What I didn't do, what I had never once done in 11 years of being the one who stayed behind, was ask why. Not why I wasn't invited this particular time. Why in general. Why it was always me. I found the real answer on Monday night, scrolling through my sister's Instagram story at 11:40 p.m., 3 days after I'd waved goodbye in that driveway. It was a video, sunset over the lake, my whole family laughing around a fire pit, my mother holding a glass of wine, my father doing the voice he does when he thinks he's being charming. 22 seconds of what looked like a perfect weekend. The caption is the part one need you to sit with, because I read it 4 times before I let myself understand it wasn't a joke. Best trip ever when she's not around, LOL. She didn't tag me. She didn't have to. Everyone scrolling that comment section already knew exactly who she was. I didn't reply. I didn't screenshot it in anger, fingers shaking, the way you might picture. I just sat there in my dark kitchen, phone light on my face, and I thought about a folder on my laptop I hadn't opened in almost a year. A folder I had started keeping, quietly, long before I ever had a reason to believe I would need it. I want to tell you how that folder got started, because it didn't begin with betrayal. It began with something much smaller, a bounce check, a forgotten form, and a habit I picked up almost by accident when I was 26 years old. I grew up the second of 3 kids, but I was the one who acted like the first. My brother Marcus is the oldest by 2 years, and my sister Renee is the youngest by 4, and somewhere in the middle of that arrangement, I became the one who noticed things. I noticed when Mom's blood pressure medication was running low before she did. I noticed when Dad's truck registration had lapsed. I noticed at 14 that nobody else in the house seemed to notice anything at all, and that if I didn't pick up the slack simply sat there, growing, until it became someone else's emergency. So I became the fixer. Not because anyone crowned me that, nobody ever sat me down and said, "Dana, this is your job now." It happened the way most family roles happen, quietly, through 1,000 small moments where I was the one who said yes, and everyone else learned that they didn't have to. By the time I was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree and a job in logistics coordination, a career, I'll admit, that fit my personality a little too perfectly, I was the person my whole family called first. Not my parents' accountant. Not a lawyer. Me. When my dad's small hardware store nearly lost its lease because he'd missed 3 notices from the landlord, I was the one who drove down, read the fine print, negotiated an extension, and set up a calendar system so it wouldn't happen again. When Renee's first apartment fell through because her credit wasn't strong enough yet, I was the one who co-signed, quietly, without telling anyone else in the family, because Renee asked me not to and I didn't think it needed announcing. I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I wasn't one. I liked being needed. There's a particular kind of validation that comes from being the reliable one, the capable one, the one who always has an answer, and for a long time, that validation was enough. It didn't occur to me to ask what I was getting back, because what I was getting back, I told myself, was being loved in a language my family understood, usefulness. My parents, Carol and Frank, weren't cruel people, and I want that on the record too, because this isn't a story about monsters. Frank ran that hardware store for 31 years and coached Little League on weekends for a decade even after none of his own kids were playing anymore. Carol worked as a school secretary for 26 years and still remembers the birthdays of kids who graduated a decade ago. They gave what they had. But what they had, when it came to attention and effort and celebration, tended to flow toward Renee, and had done so for as long as I could remember. It wasn't dramatic. It never announced itself. It showed up in smaller ways: the extra half hour of conversation after dinner, the photos that made it into the family group chat, whose graduation got the bigger party, whose apartment got help with the deposit and whose co-signature request got treated as a foregone conclusion. Marcus mostly opted out of the whole dynamic. He moved 4 hours away in his 20s and kept his involvement in family matters to holidays and group texts. That left 2 lanes in this family, really, the lane Renee occupied, where things were given, and the lane I occupied, where things were expected. I told myself for years that this was simply how our family operated, and that operating this way wasn't the same as anyone loving me less. I told myself a lot of things, honestly, in the 11 years between turning 22 and the Monday night I sat in my kitchen looking at that Instagram caption. Most of what I told myself turned out to be true in the way a coping mechanism is true enough to keep functioning, not true enough to hold up once you actually look at it. The folder started the year I turned 26, and it started for the most boring reason imaginable: a bounced reimbursement. Frank had asked me to front the cost of new shelving units for the store, about $400, and promised to pay me back as soon as the register catches up. I didn't think twice. I'd fronted smaller amounts before: birthday dinners, gas money on family trips, the occasional emergency vet bill for the family dog everyone called ours but that lived at my parents' house. This was just a bigger version of the same thing. 3 months went by. I didn't bring it up because bringing things up wasn't really part of how I operated in that house. Then one afternoon my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that she and my dad were going to help Renee with a security deposit on a new place, a nicer place than her current one, closer to downtown, with a rent that made me quietly do math in my head. I didn't say anything about the shelving units. I didn't connect the 2 events out loud. But that night, sitting at my kitchen table, I opened a blank spreadsheet for the first time and typed a single line: Dad, shelving, $412, paid 3/14, not yet reimbursed. I want to be honest about what that spreadsheet was in the beginning. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't strategy. It was closer to a coping mechanism, a way of making an invisible pattern visible to myself, if no one else. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't threaten anyone with it. I just kept adding to it, the way some people keep a journal, except mine had columns instead of paragraphs: date, amount, purpose, reimbursed, yes/no. By the time I turned 30, that single line had become a real system. Every time I covered a bill, co-signed a lease, drove 4 hours on a weekend to help move furniture, or quietly picked up a tab that should have been split 3 ways among 3 siblings, it went into the spreadsheet. Screenshots of Venmo requests that were never paid. Bank transfers with dates and memo lines. Text threads where I'd offered help and been told explicitly, "You're a lifesaver, I owe you," in messages that were never followed by repayment and never meant to be. I didn't build that archive because I was already planning some future reckoning. I built it because I am, by nature, a person who likes things documented, and because some quiet part of me, a part one wasn't ready to listen to yet, already understood that someday, I might need proof of a version of events that nobody else in my family was interested in remembering. I just didn't know yet what that someday would look like, or that it would arrive dressed as a lake house and a sunset and 22 seconds of video with a caption that finally said, out loud, what I'd suspected for over a decade. I'll say this much in fairness, because I think it matters: my parents never sat down and decided to love one daughter more than the other. I don't believe most families work that way, mine included. Favoritism rarely announces itself as a decision. It's closer to a current, something that pulls in one direction so gradually that everyone standing in the water swears the river is flowing straight. My parents would have been genuinely wounded, I think, if you'd told them plainly what the pattern looked like from where I was standing. That doesn't make the pattern less real. It just means nobody in that house was the villain they'd have needed to be for any of this to be simple. The Labor Day trip came up the way these things always came up in our family group chat, casually, as if it were already decided, 3 weeks before the holiday. Renee posted a listing for a lake house 4 hours north, 6 bedrooms, a private dock, split 5 ways between her, our parents, Marcus and his wife, and this was the detail that made my stomach tighten before I even understood why. Whoever else wants in, just let me know by Friday so I can lock in the head count. I said I was in. I said it the way you say things you assume are obvious, the way you don't think to double-check a reservation you've had for 11 years running. I asked what I could bring. Renee said she'd get back to me on logistics. She got back to me 4 days later, not in the group chat, but in a separate text, just the 2 of us. She said the house had less bedroom space than the listing implied, and that with Marcus's wife pregnant and needing her own room, and with our parents needing the downstairs room for Dad's knees, the math wasn't working out for 6 adults in what was really more like a 5-person layout. She said she was so sorry, and that she felt terrible even bringing it up. She said maybe I could come up for a day trip instead, if I wanted, once everyone was settled. I read that text twice. Then I did what I always did, which was to make it easy for her. I said, no, totally understand, don't worry about it, I actually have a lot to catch up on around here anyway. I want you to notice that last part, because I added it unprompted. Nobody asked me to make her feel better about excluding me. I did it automatically, the way you catch a falling glass without deciding to. What I didn't say, because I hadn't fully let myself think it yet, was the math that was quietly running in the back of my mind: 6 bedrooms, 5 paying adults if I didn't come, and a young pregnant wife of Marcus's who, as I would find out 3 weeks later, scrolling that same Instagram story, ended up sharing a room with Marcus the entire weekend, in the same house, with a bedroom that had, in fact, been freed up by my absence and used for something else entirely, extra storage for beach gear and a rotating cast of neighbors' kids who came by to swim. There had been room. There had always been room. What there hadn't been, apparently, was room for me specifically, dressed up as a logistics problem so that nobody would have to say the real sentence out loud. I didn't know that yet on the Tuesday I got that text. What I knew on that Tuesday was that I said, don't worry about it, and meant it, mostly, because I had said some version of that sentence to my family so many times across so many years that it no longer felt like a decision. It felt like a reflex. And reflexes, I would learn a few weeks later, are exactly the kind of thing other people learn to count on. The days between that text and the actual departure filled themselves in the way they always did. My mother called to ask if I could keep an eye on the house while they were gone, meaning, water the plants, forward any mail that looked important, and deal with the cable company if the promised technician showed up on the Saturday they'd be away. My dad texted separately to ask if I'd mind calling his insurance agent about a claim on the truck, since I was so much better at that stuff than he was. Renee sent a group message asking if anyone had a spare cooler, and when I offered mine, she said that would be perfect, could I drop it by Thursday? I did all of it. I dropped off the cooler myself on a Thursday evening, and stood in Renee's driveway for a few minutes while she loaded beach chairs into the SUV and talked, excited, about the dock and the fire pit, and how her husband had already mapped out a hike for Saturday morning. She didn't mention, standing there, that I wasn't coming. It didn't come up because in her mind, I think, it had already been resolved days earlier, filed, closed, unremarkable. On Friday morning I helped my parents load their car. My dad's knees really were bad that year, and I made sure his suitcase went in last so he wouldn't have to reach for it. My mother hugged me in the driveway and said, "You're a lifesaver, you know that. I don't know what we'd do without you holding things down," and she meant it warmly, I think, the same warm way she'd said some version of that sentence probably 200 times over the years. I said have fun, take pictures, and I meant that too. I watched 3 cars pull out of that development that weekend, my parents, Marcus and his wife's, and Renee's SUV with the kayak on top, and I went back inside my house, which suddenly felt very large and very quiet, and I did the things I said I'd do. I called the insurance agent. I let the cable technician in on Saturday and stood in my parents' living room, alone, waiting for a man to fix a service I wasn't even paying for. I answered Renee's text about whether the recycling needed to go out before Tuesday. None of it felt unusual while I was doing it. That's the part that's hardest to explain to someone who hasn't lived inside a role like this for 11 years. It didn't feel like injustice in the moment. It felt like Tuesday. It felt like Dana things. I had built an entire identity around being the person who handled Dana things, and handling them, that weekend, felt exactly like every other weekend I'd spent handling them while everyone else was somewhere with a view. I didn't confront anyone that Monday night. I closed Instagram, opened my laptop, and did the only thing that made sense to the part of me that had been keeping records for 11 years. I started building a timeline. Not out of rage, or not only out of rage, but because some instinct told me that a caption like that one doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's not a slip. It's the tip of something that's been building under the surface for a long time, and I wanted to see the whole shape of it before I decided what, if anything, I was going to do. So I went back through my spreadsheet, the one that had grown, quietly, from a single line about $400 in shelving to almost 60 entries across 11 years, and I started pulling threads. What I found, laid out in order instead of scattered across a decade of memory, was worse than I expected, in the specific way that patterns are always worse than isolated incidents. Exhibit 1, so to speak, the security deposit Renee got from our parents at 24, $11,000 for a downtown apartment, the same year I'd asked, once, gently, if they could help with a semester of grad school tuition and been told, kindly but firmly, that we don't want you to get used to relying on us, we want you to build your own independence. I had built my own independence. I had built it so thoroughly that 11 years later, I was the one funding everyone else's dependence, and being thanked for my resourcefulness in the same breath that funded my sisters. Exhibit 2, the family reunion 3 summers ago, the one I organized almost entirely by myself, venue, catering, the group activity, the group photo printed and framed as a gift for my parents' anniversary, where the toast my father gave afterward thanked Renee for always bringing this family together, while I stood in the back holding a folder of receipts nobody had asked to see. I hadn't corrected him that night. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that he probably just misspoke, that I knew what I'd done even if he'd gotten the name wrong in the moment. I found the screenshot of the group photo in my camera roll, time-stamped, folder attached, and I sat with how long I'd been willing to let "it doesn't matter" cover for things that clearly did. Exhibit 3, 18 months ago, when Marcus's transmission went out and he needed $600 to get his car back before a work trip, and I sent it within the hour because that's what I did, and the group chat thread afterward that I still had saved, where my mother wrote "this family really does take care of each other," a sentence I'd read at the time as a compliment and now read, with fresh eyes, as a description that had exactly one exception built into it, an exception nobody ever said out loud but that I was apparently supposed to understand. The family took care of each other, and I took care of the family. I want to pause here and say something honest about what it feels like to build a timeline like that at midnight, alone, 3 days after finding out your family celebrated a trip specifically for how much better it was without you. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't even feel, yet, like anger. Anger would come later, in smaller, more useful doses. What it felt like that first night was something closer to vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that a story you've told yourself for over a decade might not be the story that was actually happening. The group chat, meanwhile, hadn't gone quiet. Renee posted more photos on Tuesday, the hike, a group shot at the dock, my nephew catching his first fish, my mother's arm around my father's shoulders with the caption, "I love this family so much." Comments piled up underneath from cousins and family friends, hearts, exclamation points, "So jealous, you guys look so happy." Nobody in that thread had seen the Instagram story from Monday night. Nobody in the group chat, apparently, connected the version of the family being celebrated in public with the caption that had been posted, briefly, to a story that expired after 24 hours, and that Renee likely assumed I'd never see, since I rarely watched her stories in real time. I want to be precise about something here, because it matters to what happens later. I never once considered posting a public reply, calling anyone out in the comments, or turning this into a scene. That was never who I was in this family, and it wasn't who I was going to become just because I finally had a reason to be furious. What I did instead, what felt, at the time, like the only action available to someone who had spent 11 years being the reasonable one, was keep building the file. I added the screenshot of the caption. I added the timestamp. I cross-referenced it against the group text where Renee had told me there wasn't room, and against the photo, posted 2 days into the trip, of my nephew's swim toys spread across what was unmistakably a 6th bedroom. The family came home on Tuesday. My mother called Wednesday morning, cheerful, to thank me for handling the cable technician, and to tell me about the hike, and the fish my nephew caught, and how tired everyone was in the best possible way. I let her talk. I said, "That sounds wonderful," in the places where it was clearly expected, and I didn't mention the Instagram story, partly because I still didn't fully know what I was going to do with it, and partly because some old habit in me still wanted to protect her from the discomfort of knowing that I knew. Renee texted me separately that same afternoon, a single photo of the sunset from the dock, no caption, just, "Wish you could have seen this in person, next time for sure." I looked at that message for a long time. I thought about the folder growing on my laptop. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "It looks beautiful. Glad you guys had a good time." I hit send, and then I closed my phone, and I understood, in a way I hadn't fully let myself understand before, that I was never going to get an apology I hadn't first forced into existence, because as far as Renee was concerned, nothing had happened that required one. That gap between what Renee believed had happened and what had actually happened became the second thing I started documenting, alongside the money and the labor, the gap between the family's story about itself and the actual provable record. I started screenshotting not just the financial receipts, but the emotional ones. The captions. The group chat compliments that had exactly one exception. The texts where I was thanked for being so easy and so low maintenance, language I'd once taken as a compliment and now heard, for the first time, as a description of how convenient it was that I never asked for anything back. 2 weeks after the trip, my cousin Angela, someone I wasn't especially close to, but who followed Renee on Instagram, and had apparently seen the story before it expired, mentioned it to me at a birthday dinner for my nephew, gently, the way you mention something you're not sure the other person knows about. "Hey, I saw Renee's story from the lake thing," she said, lowering her voice near the dessert table. The caption was kind of, "I don't know, I figured it was a joke, but I wondered if you saw it." I told her I had. She looked relieved and uncomfortable at the same time, the way people look when they realize they've confirmed something they'd hoped wasn't true. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think anyone thinks that's actually funny. I think Renee just says things sometimes without thinking about who's going to see them." I appreciated Angela more than I let on that night, because she was the first person in this entire timeline who acknowledged, even quietly, even in passing near a dessert table, that something had actually happened, that I wasn't imagining a pattern, that the caption wasn't a misunderstanding I'd manufactured out of oversensitivity. It was a small thing. It mattered more than it should have. At that same birthday dinner, my father made a toast, a short one, mostly about how proud he was of my nephew turning 6, and near the end of it, almost as an aside, he said, "And thank you to Renee, as always, for pulling this whole thing together." Renee had, in fact, ordered the cake. I had bought the gift, wrapped it, coordinated with the venue about outside food policies, and driven 40 minutes each way to pick up balloons because the venue's supplier had fallen through 2 days earlier. None of that made it into the toast. I sat there with a fork in my hand and I felt something shift, quietly, from hurt into something more useful, clarity. I didn't say anything that night either. I want to be honest about how long this went on before I did anything with what I knew, because I think it matters. Between the Instagram story and what eventually happened, nearly 2 months passed. 2 months of small dinners and group chats and moments exactly like that toast, each one a little easier to notice now that I was actually looking, each one another entry in a file that had stopped being a private coping mechanism and had quietly become something closer to a case. By the middle of October, the file had a name in my head, even though I'd never said it out loud to anyone. I called it privately the record, not evidence, not ammunition, just the record, the actual shape of 11 years laid out in dates and dollar amounts and screenshots, sitting next to the version of the family that existed in captions and toasts and a group chat full of hearts. I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do with it. I only knew by then that I was done pretending those were the same family. The pattern didn't pause to let me process it either. 2 weeks after my nephew's birthday, my mother called with a request that would have been unremarkable a year earlier, and now landed like a diagnosis. Renee and her husband were thinking about buying a house, she said, a real house, not another rental, and they were just a little short on the down payment. Could I look at their numbers, since I was so good with this stuff, and maybe help them figure out how to bridge the gap? She didn't ask me to contribute money outright. Not yet. She asked me to help find a way for Renee to get what she wanted, the same role I'd occupied my entire adult life, cast once again as the capable one whose job was to make other people's outcomes possible. I said I'd take a look. I want to be honest that even then, with the record sitting open on my laptop, some old reflex in me almost said yes automatically, the way it always had. What stopped me wasn't anger. It was arithmetic. I actually did look at Renee's numbers that week, the way I'd looked at 100 family financial problems before, and what I found was that the gap wasn't really a gap in resources. It was a gap in priorities. Renee and her husband were carrying 2 car payments on vehicles neither of them needed, a streaming subscription list longer than mine, and a habit of eating out 4 or 5 nights a week that alone would have covered a meaningful chunk of what they said they were short. I didn't say any of that to my mother. I said, gently, that Renee might want to look at her monthly spending before looking for outside help, and that I wasn't in a position to contribute right now. The silence on the other end of that call told me everything I needed to know about how unusual that answer was. My mother recovered quickly, said of course, no pressure, she'd mention it to Renee, but there was a note in her voice, surprise, mostly, maybe a little disappointment, that confirmed something I'd started to suspect over the 2 months since the lake house. My no wasn't just unfamiliar to my family. It was, in some quiet way, a violation of an agreement none of us had ever actually made out loud, an agreement where I said yes, and the family said thank you, and everyone moved forward without examining the terms too closely. Thanksgiving was 7 weeks away by then, already being planned in the group chat, already assigning dishes and head counts, already, I noticed without much surprise, assuming I'd be handling the seating logistics and the grocery run the way I did every year. I looked at that group chat one evening in late October, at the casual, cheerful assumption baked into every message, and I understood that I had a choice to make about what Thanksgiving was going to be. I could keep playing the role I'd played for 11 years, quietly, with the record sitting unopened on my laptop as a kind of private consolation prize. Or I could finally let the record do the thing I'd apparently been building it to do, whether I'd admitted that to myself or not. I didn't decide that night. I want to be honest that the decision took longer than the anger did, because anger is fast and decisions, real ones, are slow. What I did that night was close the laptop, sit in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd first read that caption 2 months earlier, and ask myself a question I'd never once let myself ask in 11 years. What did I actually want to happen next? I didn't get an answer that night. But I did something smaller, something that felt, at the time, less like a decision and more like a formality. I made a copy of the entire spreadsheet, exported every screenshot into a single dated folder, and backed it up somewhere Renee's Wi-Fi password couldn't reach it. I told myself I was just being organized. I think, underneath that, I already knew I was preparing something, even if I wasn't ready to say what yet. The low point, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It came on a Tuesday in early November, on the phone with my mother, in a conversation about nothing in particular, logistics for Thanksgiving, whether the folding table from the garage still worked, whether I could pick up the turkey from the butcher since I'd be driving past anyway. Ordinary. The kind of call we'd had 1,000 times. Near the end of it, almost as a throwaway, my mother said, "You know, I don't know what we'd do without you handling all this. You're just so good at it, and honestly, I think that's part of why we don't worry about including you in every little thing. We know you're solid, you don't need the fuss the way some people do." She meant it as a compliment. I understood that even as I heard it, even as something in my chest went very still and very quiet. She meant it as a compliment, and that was the whole problem. laid out in a single sentence I don't think she'll ever fully understand the weight of. I had been so reliable, for so long, that my reliability had become the reason I didn't get invited to things. My competence had been quietly recast, somewhere along the way, as evidence that I didn't need what everyone else got: attention, inclusion, a room at the lake house, because I was solid. Because I didn't need the fuss. I got off that call and sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for 11 minutes without turning the key. I wasn't crying. I want to be precise about that, because I think people expect a moment like this to look a certain way, and mine didn't. I was just still, in the specific way you go still when something reorganizes itself permanently inside you. 11 years of being told, in 100 indirect ways, that my usefulness was a kind of currency, finally collapsed into one plain sentence spoken by my own mother without a trace of unkindness in her voice. We don't worry about including you because you don't need the fuss. I didn't need the fuss. I had built an entire adult identity around not needing the fuss, and it had worked exactly as well as advertised. I had gotten exactly what I trained my family to expect from me, and nothing more. The lake house wasn't an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of 11 years of me teaching everyone around me, patiently, consistently, that I was the kind of person who could be left out, and would still handle the cable technician without complaint. I started the car eventually. I drove home. And somewhere on that drive, without any dramatic internal monologue, without deciding it the way you decide something in a movie, I made the actual decision, quietly, the same quiet way I'd made every other decision in this family for a decade. I was going to bring the record to Thanksgiving. Not to punish anyone. Not even, really, to win an argument. I was going to bring it because I was tired of being the only person in that family who knew the truth of what the last 11 years had actually cost me, and because some part of me, the part that had been keeping that spreadsheet since I was 26, had apparently always known this day was coming. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing the way I prepared everything, quietly, thoroughly, without telling a single person what I was planning. I didn't call Marcus to warn him. I didn't hint to Angela that something was coming. I printed nothing yet, because printing felt too final for a decision I still wanted to be able to walk back if, somehow, I woke up one morning and felt differently. I organized the folder instead, cleaned up the file names, made sure every screenshot had a date visible, made sure the spreadsheet told a story a stranger could follow in under 5 minutes, because I understood, by then, that the point was never going to be to overwhelm my family with volume. The point was going to be to make the pattern undeniable, in the smallest number of pieces necessary to do that. Thanksgiving landed on a bright, cold Thursday, and by 2 in the afternoon my parents' house was full in the way it always was, Marcus and his wife with the baby, Renee, and her husband, my parents moving between the kitchen and the dining room, the smell of turkey and the sound of a football game nobody was really watching. I'd arrived early, as always, to help set up, and I'd brought the folder with me in my bag, a slim manila folder holding maybe 15 printed pages, along with my laptop, closed, sitting on the passenger seat like something I still hadn't fully committed to using. Dinner went the way Thanksgiving dinners in my family always went. My mother thanked everyone for coming, and made a small joke about the turkey being slightly overdone. My father said grace, and in it, the way he did most years, he thanked God for a family that takes care of each other, the same phrase I'd heard a version of for over a decade, the same phrase that had once made me feel warm, and now made something in my chest tighten with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. The moment that mattered came about 40 minutes into dinner, over pie, when the conversation drifted, as it often did, toward the lake house. Marcus's wife hadn't been able to make the trip work with the baby, and someone was recapping the highlights for her benefit. Renee laughed, telling the story of the fire pit and the kayak, and then, without any particular malice, without seeming to remember the caption at all, she said, honestly, it was such a relaxing weekend. Everyone got along so well, no drama, you know. Sometimes it's just nice when it's easy. I don't think she meant anything specific by it. I don't think in that moment she connected easy to the fact that I hadn't been there, or to what she'd written underneath that sunset video 3 months earlier. But something in the phrase, no drama, you know, sometimes it's just nice when it's easy, landed in the exact place my mother's sentence had landed weeks earlier in that grocery store parking lot. Easy. Solid. Doesn't need the fuss. 3 different phrases from 3 different people, describing the same 11-year-old arrangement from 3 different angles, and all of them adding up to the same quiet verdict. It was nicer when I wasn't there to complicate things with my presence. I set down my fork. I want to describe exactly what that felt like, because it wasn't rage, even now, even at the end of all of it. It was closer to stillness, the same stillness from the parking lot, except this time, I wasn't alone in a car. I was sitting at a table with 8 people who had spent the better part of a decade being fluent in a version of our family that I had, apparently, been the only one paying the actual cost for. "Can I say something?" I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected and steadier too. The table went a little quiet, the way tables do when someone who almost never asks for the floor suddenly asks for it. "I heard what you posted about the lake house, Renee," I said. "The caption on your story. Best trip ever when she's not around. I saw it the same night you posted it back in September." I didn't say anything then, because I wanted to understand it first, instead of just reacting to it. The table had gone fully silent now. Renee's face did something complicated, surprise first, then the beginning of an apology forming, the kind of reflexive, "Oh my God, I was joking, I didn't mean," that I could see queuing up behind her eyes. I didn't wait for it, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I understood, with a clarity I hadn't had access to 3 months earlier, that an apology for one caption wasn't actually the thing I needed. The caption wasn't the injury. It was just the first time anyone in this family had said the quiet part out loud, in writing, where I could actually see it. "I'm not bringing this up to make you feel bad about a joke," I said, reaching down and pulling the folder out of my bag, setting it on the table next to the pie. "I'm bringing it up because it made me go back and actually look at the last 11 years instead of just feeling my way through them. And I want to show you what I found, because I don't think any of you have actually seen it laid out before. I don't think I had, either, until I did this." I opened the folder. The first page was simple, deliberately so. I'd designed it that way, the same way I designed everything, thinking 3 steps ahead without fully admitting to myself that's what I was doing. It was a single timeline, 11 years compressed onto one sheet of paper, dates down the left side, dollar amounts and hours down the right, a short description in the middle of each line. Shelving units, 2015. Renee's security deposit, the same year, funded entirely by our parents. Marcus's transmission, 18 months ago. The reunion I organized alone. The birthday balloons. 61 entries in total, spanning just over a decade, next to a running total at the bottom that I had calculated the week before and still hadn't quite let myself absorb. Just under $29,000 in money I had given, fronted, or never been reimbursed for, and by a much rougher estimate, converting hours into an hourly rate I picked almost arbitrarily, somewhere north of 1,100 hours of unpaid logistics, planning, and labor. My father picked up the page first. I watched his eyes move down the list, slower than I expected, his jaw tightening somewhere around the 4th or 5th line. My mother reached for it next, and I watched her face do something I hadn't seen it do in a long time, not defensiveness, not yet, just a kind of stunned recalculation, the look of someone doing arithmetic they'd never once thought to attempt. "This can't be right," Renee said, but her voice had already lost the confidence it started with. $29,000. That doesn't, she stopped herself, looking down the list again, and I watched her land on her own name 3 separate times before she'd made it halfway down the page. "It's right," I said. "Every line has a receipt, a bank transfer, or a screenshot behind it. I have all of it on my laptop if anyone wants to see the source instead of just the summary. I didn't build this to embarrass anyone at Thanksgiving. I built it because for 11 years I told myself a story about this family that this page proves wasn't true, and I think all of you have been telling yourselves a version of that same story too." Nobody said anything for a moment. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer went off for a dish nobody moved to check. I went through it slowly, one line at a time, the way I'd planned to, though I hadn't been sure until that exact moment that I'd actually have the nerve to do it out loud. I started with the security deposit because it was the oldest and I think the clearest. Renee, when I asked about help with grad school tuition, the answer was that you two didn't want me to get used to relying on you, that you wanted me to build independence. That was the same year you got $11,000 for a downtown apartment. I'm not saying you didn't deserve help. I'm saying I got a lesson about self-reliance, and you got a deposit, and nobody in this family ever seemed to notice those were happening at the same time. My mother started to say something, an explanation, I could tell, already forming, something about how apartments and tuition weren't really comparable, how the circumstances were different, and then she stopped herself visibly and didn't finish the sentence. I've thought about that stopped sentence a lot since. I think it was the first honest moment of the whole conversation, the moment she reached for a justification and, for once, didn't fully trust it enough to say it out loud. I moved to the toast at the reunion, the one where my father thanked Renee for always bringing this family together. I didn't accuse him of anything. I just laid the timeline of who'd booked the venue, ordered the catering, and coordinated the framed photo next to the audio memory of what he'd actually said that night, and I watched him go very quiet, the particular quiet of a man realizing he'd said something in good faith that turned out to be wrong in a way that mattered. I didn't mean, he started. I know you didn't, I said, and I meant it. That's actually the whole point. None of this happened because anyone meant to hurt me. It happened because I made it so easy not to notice that nobody ever had to. Marcus, who'd been quiet through most of it, spoke up then, and I want to give him credit for what he said, because it was the first thing anyone had said all evening that wasn't defensive. The transmission thing, he said slowly. You sent that within like an hour. I don't think I ever actually paid you back for that, did I? No, I said. You didn't. And I never brought it up, because bringing it up wasn't really something I knew how to do until about 3 months ago. Renee had gone quiet by then too, staring at the page, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but I want to be clear that I didn't feel triumphant watching that. I felt tired, mostly, and something close to relief, the specific relief of finally being believed about something you've known alone for a very long time. The caption, she said. I really was joking. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I want you to know I wasn't trying to say what it sounds like I was saying. I believe that, I said. I think that's actually what scares me more than if you'd meant it. If you'd meant it, at least it would have been a choice someone made on purpose. Instead it was just true, underneath, without anyone deciding it should be. That's the part one needed you all to see. Nobody applauded. Nobody hugged it out dramatically over pie. What happened instead was quieter, and I think, more honest. My father reached over and picked the page back up, read it again, slower this time, and said, I want to actually look at this properly. Not tonight. But properly, with you, this week. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was the first time in 11 years anyone in that family had asked to see the whole picture, instead of asking me to keep handling it. We didn't finish dessert that night in any normal sense. The pie sat mostly untouched, and the football game kept playing to no one, and for a long time nobody said much of anything at all, the particular silence of a family recalibrating something it had taken 11 years to build and had just watched come apart in about 20 minutes. Eventually my mother got up and started clearing plates, on autopilot, the way people do when they need their hands to be doing something ordinary while their mind catches up to what just happened. I got up to help her, also on autopilot, and she stopped me at the sink, hands wet, and said, quietly, so the others wouldn't hear, I didn't know. I want you to know I actually didn't know, not like this. I believe you, I told her, and I did. That was the strange, unresolved shape of the whole evening. Nobody in that room was a villain exactly, and yet the math on that page was real regardless of anyone's intentions, and both of those things were true at the same time, sitting there next to each other, refusing to cancel out. Renee found me alone in the kitchen a little later, while I was wrapping leftovers, and she didn't try to explain the caption again. She just said, I want to actually pay you back. Not just the shelving thing or the transmission thing. All of it, or as much as we can figure out. I don't know how long that'll take, but I want to start. I told her I didn't need it done that night. I told her what I actually wanted was simpler and harder than money. I wanted, going forward, to stop being the automatic answer to every problem in this family, and to start being someone who got invited to things because people wanted me there, not because they needed something handled while I was around. She said okay. It wasn't a grand promise, delivered with music swelling underneath it. It was just two people standing in a kitchen full of foil-wrapped leftovers, agreeing, quietly, that something between them was going to have to change, without either of us being entirely sure yet what that change would look like in practice. I wish I could tell you that Thanksgiving fixed everything, that my family transformed overnight into a group of people who split things evenly and remembered whose idea things actually were. That's not what happened, and I think it's important to say that clearly, because I don't want to leave you with a tidier ending than the one I actually got. What happened instead was slower and messier and in its own way, more real. My father did sit down with me that week, exactly as he'd promised, and we went through the record together at his kitchen table, and I watched a 63-year-old man who had genuinely believed his family took care of each other reckon page by page, with a version of events he'd never had reason to question before. He didn't get everything right in that conversation. At one point he tried to explain away the reunion toast by saying he probably just had Renee's name in his head that week for reasons that had nothing to do with me, and I had to sit there and let that land without either accepting it as an excuse or turning it into a bigger fight than it needed to be. That's the part nobody tells you about a moment like the one at that dinner table. The reveal isn't the ending. It's the beginning of a much longer, much less cinematic process of two people learning to see the same 11 years differently, a little at a time, with plenty of missteps along the way. Renee started paying me back in January, small amounts, more consistent than dramatic, a couple $100 a month with a note attached each time, for the deposit, for the reunion stuff, working backward through the list on her own initiative, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened. We're not close in the way some sisters are close. I don't know if we ever will be. But she asks now before assuming. That's new. She asked me in February if I wanted to come look at a house she and her husband were considering, not because she needed my logistics brain to run numbers, but because she said she wanted my opinion. I sat in the car outside that house for a second before going in, just absorbing how unfamiliar that sentence still felt, wanted my opinion, not needed my help. My mother is the one who's changed the least, if I'm honest, and I think that's worth saying too, because growth in families is rarely evenly distributed. She still occasionally says something that has the shape of the old pattern, a passing comment about how easy I am, a slight overcorrection where she now overexplains invitations to me in a way that feels less like inclusion and more like guilt management. I've started saying something small each time it happens, gently, the way I said things at that Thanksgiving table. I noticed that, or that's the thing we talked about, just enough to keep the pattern visible instead of letting it slide back into the water where nobody has to look at it. The lake house came up again this past summer, a full year after the one that started all of this. Renee texted the group chat in July, already planning, and this time the message wasn't an assumption about headcount and bedroom math. It was a direct question, addressed to me specifically, asking what dates worked on my end before anyone else's were finalized. I sat with my phone for a minute, recognizing the specific, deliberate effort behind such an ordinary-looking text, and then I answered it the way I probably should have learned to answer things a decade earlier, honestly, and without immediately trying to make it easy for everyone else. I went that summer. I got my own room. Nobody called it complicated. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've thought about it a lot, in the months since that Thanksgiving, turning it over the way I used to turn over spreadsheet entries at midnight, I don't think it's the lesson people expect from a story like this. It isn't keep receipts so you can win an argument someday, though I understand why that's the part that sticks. The receipts weren't the point. The receipts were just the accident of my personality, the byproduct of being someone who happens to be organized, applied for 11 years to a situation that needed a different kind of attention entirely. The actual lesson, the one I keep coming back to, is smaller and harder to package into a single sentence, but I'll try. Being reliable is not the same thing as being valued, and a family, or a friendship, or a job, or any relationship really, will very quietly teach you exactly how much space you're allowed to take up based on how much you ask for. I never asked for anything. So I never got told no, and I also never got told yes to the things that actually mattered, inclusion, attention, a seat that didn't have to be earned by handling the cable technician while everyone else watched a sunset without me. I don't think that lesson is unique to families, either, even though this happens to be a family story. I've heard versions of it from friends describing certain friendships, and from coworkers describing certain jobs, always circling the same quiet arithmetic. The people who ask for the least tend to receive the least, not because anyone sets out to shortchange them, but because it is simply easier for everyone else to let a willing person keep being willing. I didn't confront my family because I wanted revenge, and I want to be honest that if revenge was ever mixed in there somewhere, underneath everything else, it wasn't what carried me through that dinner table conversation. What carried me through it was simpler. I was tired of being the only person who knew the truth of my own life inside that family, and I finally understood that the truth doesn't stop being true just because you're the only one who's been keeping track of it. Marcus, of all people, is the one who surprised me most in the year since. He'd never been part of the day-to-day dynamic the way Renee and my parents were. He'd opted out of most of it years earlier by moving 4 hours away, but something about that Thanksgiving seemed to land on him harder than I expected. He called me in December, out of nowhere, and said he'd been thinking about all the times he'd let me cover something without following up, not because he didn't care, but because it had simply never occurred to him that it cost me anything to keep saying yes. He paid back the transmission money that week. With interest he insisted on adding even though I told him it wasn't necessary, and he's texted me every few months since, small check-ins that have nothing to do with logistics or favors, just ordinary conversation, the kind of thing that shouldn't feel remarkable between siblings and somehow, for us, still does. I also want to say something about the folder itself, because people sometimes ask, once they hear this story, whether I still keep it, whether I'm still tracking every dollar and every hour the way I did for 11 years. I'm not, and I think that's actually the most important part of how things have changed. The spreadsheet was never a healthy habit. It was a coping mechanism built by someone who didn't feel safe asking directly for what she needed, so she built a case file instead, quietly, for over a decade, just in case she ever needed to prove she wasn't imagining things. I don't need that file anymore, not because everything is perfectly resolved, but because I've started saying things out loud in real time instead of saving them for a folder, a small comment when something feels unbalanced, a direct answer instead of an automatic yes, a request stated plainly instead of hoped for silently and then quietly logged when it didn't arrive. It's a slower way to live than keeping a spreadsheet. I think it's a truer one. There's a version of this story where I never open that Instagram story that Monday night, where the caption expires after 24 hours the way it was designed to, unseen, and I go on for another 11 years being the reliable one, thanked constantly and included rarely, mistaking usefulness for love because nobody had ever shown me the difference up close. I think about that version sometimes, not with dread exactly, but with a kind of quiet gratitude that I happened to be scrolling at 11:40 that particular night. Not every family gets a caption like that one, handed to them at 11:40 on a random Monday night. Not every pattern announces itself in writing, time-stamped, impossible to argue with later. Most people have to notice the quieter version of that same sentence entirely on their own, without a screenshot to point to, which I think is actually harder, not easier, than what happened to me that particular night. If any part of this sounded familiar to you, if you're the one who gets called reliable instead of loved, the one who's easy instead of included, the one who's solid instead of wanted, I gently ask you to start paying attention to the pattern, the way I eventually did, whether or not you ever build a spreadsheet out of it. You don't need $29,000 of receipts to be allowed to say something changed. You just need to notice, honestly, what it's actually costing you to keep being the person nobody has to worry about, and to notice it before someone hands you the proof of it by accident, the way my own sister's caption ended up accidentally handing it to me. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I mean that literally, not as a line I say out of habit, and if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one coming next week that I think you're going to want to hear, and I promise you it won't take 11 long years to see the ending coming the way it took me.